Hey there, viewers. Here's a fun one. If you had to eat the same meal every day for a year, what would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments. Today, we're taking a look at what Diddy typically eats behind bars, and let's just say, it's a far cry from the luxury he was used to. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Fall from Lavish Feasts to Prison Trays. When Sean Diddy Combs arrived at MDC Brooklyn, I didn't expect much fanfare. Guards generally don't fuss over new arrivals, even if they're high profile. Most are too busy managing the constant shuffle of inmates. Still, word spread among us that a celebrity was on his way in. Some guys got excited, others rolled their eyes. I tried to keep to myself, figuring it would come to light soon enough. The day he showed up, I was mopping the corridor floors near the intake area. Through the glass window and the heavy steel door, I saw him step inside. He looked exhausted, the way most new arrivals do. Shoulders tense, hair slightly disheveled, eyes scanning the environment as if he couldn't believe it was real. Intake is no joke. They strip you down, process your information, take your belongings. By the time you actually set foot in a cell, you're mentally drained. Even he wasn't immune to that routine. The first thing I noticed was how short he seemed in person. Not physically small, but shrunken by the weight of his new surroundings. He wore the same orange jumpsuit as the rest of us. None of that outside status carried any authority in here. A guard led him down the hall, directing him into a holding cell for a final check. I kept my eyes on my mop, but I saw enough to confirm the rumors. It was definitely him. I heard through the grapevine that his first meal at MDC was a bologna sandwich on white bread, a bruised apple, and a juice box. That's the standard intake meal, a quick fix that's hardly edible. The bread is often stale around the edges, the apple typically has a few brown spots, and the juice tastes like watered-down sugar. But it's enough to fill a void. For someone used to private chefs and tables piled high with gourmet spreads, it must have felt like a slap in the face. Later that evening, I glimpsed him in the corridor, standing in line with the rest of us for dinner. If you arrive too late, you miss it entirely. Dinner was a scoop of overcooked rice and some mystery meat in a thin gravy slopped onto a plastic tray. Diddy stood there, tray in hand, staring at the food as if it might vanish if he blinked. Then he looked around, uncertain where to sit. By the time I found my usual seat in the chow hall, a cramped, loud space with bolted-down tables, he had settled at a corner spot by himself. The lights overhead flickered and the air smelled like boiled vegetables and sweaty bodies. A few curious inmates watched him from a distance, but most returned to their own trays. Hunger wins over celebrity watching pretty fast. I couldn't hear exactly what he said when he took his first bite, but his expression told me everything. Pure disbelief. He picked at the meal, half-heartedly scooping the rice around. Guards stood along the walls, gazes flicking back and forth. If you're new, you learn quickly that there's no real privacy. You eat when they say, you sit where they allow, and you get up when they decide it's time. I wondered if Diddy had fully grasped that. Outside, he'd controlled every facet of his life. Here, he'd lost control overnight. I took a bite of my own tray, the meat chewy and barely seasoned. Years ago, I'd have gagged, but now I'd grown numb to the taste. Sometimes, I even force myself to imagine it's something else, just to get through the meal. After dinner, we dumped our trays and headed back to our units. I passed by him in the corridor once more. He was walking slowly, like a man in a daze. A couple of inmates behind him murmured jokes about how he'd never last. Others just shrugged. We've seen famous faces come and go. The system rarely changes for anyone. Back in my cell, I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling. My cellmate, Raul, asked if I'd seen the big-time mogul yet. I nodded, describing how dazed he looked. Raul smirked, saying, "Man, that's how we all looked on day one." It was true. No one steps into MDC looking confident. The place knocks you down fast, especially if you arrive fresh from a life of luxury. That night I drifted off thinking about how quickly wealth and status can crumble in here. One moment, you're living in penthouses, hosting lavish dinners with personal chefs. The next, you're picking at overcooked rice on a plastic tray, flinching every time a guard barks an order. It's a harsh reminder that no one is truly above the system once those gates close behind you. The next morning at breakfast, I spotted Diddy again. He looked more worn out, if that was possible. Intake does that. It keeps you awake half the night, for forms, photos, ID checks. Then they shove you into a crowded cell. By sunrise, you've barely slept, and they're already rushing you to the chow hall for watery coffee and powdered eggs. He seemed to be in a mild state of shock, just going through the motion. Even if the guards weren't outwardly whispering about his arrival, I could tell some were intrigued by the fact that a man who once dominated headlines was now being ushered through the same lines as everyone else. He hesitated at the cafeteria door, scanning for a place to sit. Another sign of newness, veterans claim their spots, either with friends or affiliated groups. I watched him choose a table that had 2 empty seats, leaving a buffer from the other inmates. He poked at his food, probably tasting the gritty texture of powdered eggs for the first time. A slight grimace crossed his face, and he took a sip of the watery coffee, only to set it down in disappointment. As I gathered my own tray and sat with Raul, I could still see him out of the corner of my eye. He ate mechanically, more out of necessity than acceptance. Once you get past the initial revulsion, you realize you have no choice. Either eat or go hungry, and hunger in prison is a special kind of misery. I'd learned that lesson quickly in my early days here. Now, I wondered how long it would take him to come to the same realization. After breakfast, we all filed out. Diddy blended into the orange sea, but not completely. A few curious inmates gave him second glances, sizing him up. Some might have been fans on the outside, others might have felt resentment. High-profile newcomers can become targets for extortion or worse. But that drama often takes time to brew. In the meantime, he still had the rest of the intake procedure to face. Orientation, a brief rundown of prison rules, more paperwork. Food was just the first shock. When I returned to my cell, I found myself reflecting on how drastically his life had changed in less than 24 hours. One day, he's probably deciding which caviar to serve at a private function. The next, he's stuck with a bologna sandwich and stale bread. The shift was so sharp it left me uneasy, even though I'm no stranger to this place. It was a reminder of how quickly fortune can vanish. A guard's voice echoed down the hallway, signaling a block count, and I snapped out of my thoughts. As the bars slid shut for the count, I thought about how food here wasn't just about nutrition, it was about control. Every meal hammered home the fact that you no longer call the shots. And if there's one thing I knew about men like Diddy, it's that losing control hurts far more than bland flavors ever could. He was just beginning to learn that, and the lessons would only get tougher from here on out. I shut my eyes, letting the sounds of the block fade into a dull roar. Part of me felt a sliver of pity for him. Another part felt indifferent. This is just how it works. Either you adapt or you suffer. For now, he looked like he was still grappling with the shock of it all. That jarring first step into a reality where your name doesn't buy you a better meal. It was only a matter of time before he learned that in this place, even the simple act of eating shapes who you become. Chapter 2. Breakfast Behind Bars. A harsh awakening. The buzzers sounded before dawn, echoing through the block. My eyes snapped open as fluorescent lights flickered on, harsh and unrelenting. The routine never changes. Wake up, shuffle to the chow hall, hope for something halfway edible. Raul groaned from the bunk above me, muttering curses about the early morning. I didn't blame him. Even after years, it's jarring to be jolted awake by that buzzing alarm. As we stepped into the corridor, I noticed Diddy a few bodies ahead, moving slowly. He rubbed his eyes like he hadn't slept at all, which was likely the case. Intake nights are rough, and the thin mattress offers little comfort. He wore the standard-issue jumpsuit, the same tired expression as everyone else at this hour. If anything, he looked even more drained than the day before. We filed into the chow hall, each of us grabbing a tray from the metal counter. The kitchen workers stood behind giant steel vats, ladling out scoops of powdered eggs that congealed almost instantly. Next came a piece of cornbread, often stale around the edges, and a small carton of milk. If you were lucky, you got a lukewarm cup of coffee poured into a styrofoam cup. This morning, I wasn't lucky. The coffee had run out by the time I reached the end of the line, so I settled for water. I took my usual seat near the back, trying to ignore the bitter smell of scorched eggs. Across the room, Diddy hovered near a table that was half full. It seemed he was unsure about where to sit, maybe worried about intruding on established cliques. Finally, he chose a spot with only one other occupant, a tall, quiet inmate I recognized as Mace. Mace didn't talk much, which probably appealed to Diddy's desire to be left alone. He set his tray down, peering at the eggs like he was trying to figure out what they were made of. Then he lifted the cornbread, gave it a tentative sniff, and took a small bite. His face scrunched up in mild disgust, but he forced himself to chew. I remember doing the exact same thing when I first arrived, trying to determine if the food was truly that bad or if I was just unaccustomed to institutional cooking. A few minutes later, a skinny inmate named J-Lo, short for Jerome Lopez, though he embraced the nickname, wandered past Diddy's table. He casually dropped a little hot sauce packet within arm's reach. Diddy looked up, puzzled. "Helps with the eggs," he said, tapping the packet. There was a moment of silent tension. In prison, free gifts can be a calculated move. But J-Lo's expression seemed genuine. Maybe it was an act of goodwill, or maybe he wanted a future favor. You can never be sure. Diddy picked up the packet, reading the tiny label as if it held a secret code. Then he tore it open and drizzled the sauce onto his eggs. The taste is still chalky, but the spice cuts the blandness. He nodded to J-Lo, a polite thank you without words. J-Lo smirked and walked off, leaving Diddy to test the new flavor. From my spot, I saw him take another bite, this time with the hot sauce. He still looked unimpressed, but at least he wasn't gagging. The other men at adjacent tables threw him quick glances, probably curious if he'd drop the sauce packet or share more. In here, everything is observed. How you eat, what you eat, whether you're polite, whether you brush off attempts at conversation. Each gesture can define your relationships going forward. I turned back to my own tray, swallowing the powdered eggs with a gulp of water. They stuck to the back of my throat, but hunger overcame distaste. A guard patrolled the perimeter, baton tapping rhythmically against his leg, reminding everyone to keep it civil. Occasionally, new inmates cause scenes when they realize there aren't better options. Screaming at the guards won't change the menu, though. We all learned that fast. After 10 minutes or so, the guard signaled for us to clear out. I dumped the remnants of my eggs in the trash and placed the tray on the stack at the end of the counter. Diddy came up behind me, discarding half his cornbread. He'd only eaten a portion of it, though he carried the coffee cup with him. When he got in line behind me, our eyes met briefly. He gave a tight nod, an acknowledgement maybe, and I returned it. We headed back to the unit in a slow-moving line. Overhead lights buzzed, the smell of disinfectant clung to the air. I caught bits of conversation, guys complaining about the eggs, griping about the early hour, whispering about upcoming commissary orders. Diddy mostly kept quiet, sipping from his styrofoam cup. I guessed he was still trying to wake up, and maybe his mind was spinning over how drastically his morning ritual had changed. No more gourmet omelets or imported coffee beans. Now it was powdered eggs and stale cornbread before the sun even rose. Once in the unit, everyone dispersed to their cells or common areas. I had to grab cleaning supplies from a storage closet. As I did, I noticed Diddy lingering by the payphones, scanning the posted instructions for making calls. He held the coffee cup, took one last sip, then tossed it into a trash bin. His face was unreadable. Some combination of fatigue and resignation, I guessed. Maybe he was already planning how to find better coffee through the commissary. A few of the other inmates in the common area discussed him openly. I overheard one guy say, "He'll crack soon enough. You can't go from steak dinners to powdered eggs without losing it." Another shrugged, "Or he'll wise up and figure out how to hustle in here. Money still means something after all." They laughed, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. I wondered which side of that coin Diddy would land on. Would he crack? Or would he adapt? The guards strode by, ordering me and Raoul to mop the floors in front of the showers. We complied. As I pushed the mop across the tiles, I saw Diddy wandering toward his cell. The door was open, though he'd eventually learn that these brief moments of an open door were privileges, not rights. He stepped inside, out of sight. Maybe he wanted a moment alone, to process. Maybe he just needed to rest after barely sleeping, I couldn't say. But as I cleaned, I thought about that packet of hot sauce. It seemed like such a small gesture, yet it was the first real sign of how Diddy might navigate this place. Small acts of bartering or exchanging can open doors, or close them, if he misreads the motive. Inmates often test newcomers with something minor to see if they'll reciprocate or act entitled. The fact that he accepted it and gave a nod back might have been a subtle hint that he wasn't above the environment, a tiny piece of surrender. I'd seen other newcomers sneer at the lowly offerings of prison life, refusing them out of pride or disgust. They usually had a harder time adjusting. Admitting that hot sauce helps the eggs go down is in its own way acknowledging the reality. The food here won't improve, so you adapt or starve. The question was whether Diddy would keep adapting, or would there be a moment that pushed him over the edge. Raul and I finished mopping and returned the supplies to the closet. Morning head count was next, so we hurried back to our cell. While we waited, I reflected on how different life must be for Diddy now. Before, mornings were probably a leisurely affair, sleeping in, a personal chef preparing espressos, fresh fruit, custom omelets. Now, he had to wake up to a horn and race for a chance at watery coffee and stale cornbread. If he wanted anything better, he'd have to learn the unspoken rules of commissary and bartering, just like the rest of us. The guard's voice blared over the intercom, ordering everyone to stand by their bunks. I took my position, arms at my sides. Through the open cell door, I could see an officer peering into each cell, marking names off a list. Diddy's cell was 2 doors down. I glimpsed him standing there, looking tired but composed. He'd survived another meal, another morning. For now, that was enough. Because in here every day starts the same. You wake up before you're ready, and you eat whatever's put in front of you, telling yourself it could be worse. Whether Diddy could keep telling himself that remained to be seen. Chapter 3. Lunch. A tray of regret. Lunch at MDC Brooklyn is served at 11 a.m., a time that used to make me laugh. Calling it lunch feels like a stretch. It's more of a mid-morning meal, another checkpoint in the day. By the time 11 rolls around, most of us are barely over breakfast. Yet here we are, lining up again with plastic trays in hand, ready to see what lifeless offering awaits. That day, I shuffled forward, tray pressed against my stomach. The guard at the door lazily waved me in, ignoring my presence. As I approached the serving counter, I caught a whiff of something fried. My hopes rose slightly. Maybe we'd get something edible, but the kitchen worker dropped a meager chicken patty onto my tray, and I recognized the usual rubbery texture. It was topped with a sad slice of cheese that looked like it had been melted hours ago and left to congeal. A scoop of canned corn followed, watery and bland. If I was lucky, I might snag a ketchup packet, but those tended to disappear fast. I found a seat, setting the tray down as I looked around. The chow hall buzzed with overlapping conversations, the scrape of chairs and the clang of trays. Someone banged their cup against the table, trying to get a friend's attention. A guard barked for them to cut it out. Next to me, Raoul inspected his patty, muttering curses about how it smelled stale. I tried a bite, confirming it was lukewarm at best. A few minutes later, Diddy came through the door, carefully balancing his tray. He scanned the room, as he often did, seeming both anxious and calculating. Eventually, he settled at a table that was half empty. He lowered himself onto the metal bench, eyes flicking between his patty and the other inmates around him. I watched him take a quick inventory of ketchup packets, but there weren't any left on the communal tray dispenser. He lifted the top bun, revealing the sad patty beneath. A half-melted square of cheese clung to it, looking as if it might slide off any second. He glanced around, maybe hoping to spot someone with extra ketchup, but no one offered. With a resigned shrug, he pressed the bun back on and took a bite. From where I sat, I could see him chew slowly, then pause. The rubbery texture probably surprised him, or maybe he just felt a wave of disgust. Either way, he forced himself to swallow. In the surrounding tables, I noticed a few curious looks aimed in his direction. Most of these guys had been in and out of the system for years. They were used to the daily monotony of cafeteria meals. Seeing someone who once lived in luxury forced into this routine intrigued them. It was like watching a fish out of water, wondering if it would adapt or suffocate. A group of inmates in the corner started whispering, throwing quick glances Diddy's way. I couldn't catch everything they said, but I caught enough to sense their skepticism. "He won't eat that," one hissed. "He'll starve first," another snorted. "Nah, he'll cave. They all do." In prison, there's a fascination with watching the high and mighty brought low. It can be as much entertainment as it is a reminder that nobody's untouchable. Diddy tried another bite, then sipped from the small carton of milk that came with the meal. His expression turned sour. MDC milk can be off-tasting, sometimes on the edge of going bad. He set it down and fiddled with the canned corn, pushing it around with his spork. Maybe he was weighing whether to bother eating it. He stabbed a few kernels and lifted them to his mouth. Another grimace followed. I finished my own patty, ignoring the stale bun. Desperation teaches you to focus on the protein, such as it is, to keep yourself going. I left the corn, though. The watery taste never sat right with me. Raoul gulped his down, saying he couldn't afford to be picky. He wanted any calories he could get before heading out to his job assignment. I looked back at Diddy. He'd eaten maybe half of his patty, the rest sitting abandoned on the tray. He tore a small piece of the bun, as if considering whether to nibble on it, then let it drop. A few minutes later, a guard yelled for us to clear out. People scrambled to dump their trays in the trash and line up. Some guys stuffed bread or fruit into their pockets if they didn't finish it, hoping to snack on it later. I saw Diddy eye the bread for a moment before discarding it. Maybe it was too far gone, or maybe he didn't realize that saving scraps is a survival tactic. He was still learning. As we filed out, the corridor filled with the usual midday clamor. Footsteps echoing, guards barking commands, inmates exchanging hurried words about commissary or phone time. Diddy walked with a slow, detached stride. He kept his head down, but his eyes flicked around, taking in every detail. This place was still new to him, and I could sense the internal battle. His stomach wanted more, but his mind and pride balked at the taste. By the time we reached the common area, the chatter had shifted to other topics. Court dates, mail call, the next recreational period. Diddy headed toward the water fountain, took a quick sip, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. It was small compensation for the subpar lunch. I wondered if he felt the hunger pang already, that hollow feeling that creeps in when you know the meal you just had wasn't enough to sustain you until dinner. Raoul and I claimed a table in the corner to rest before our work detail. From there, I watched as a couple of inmates sidled up to Diddy. They struck up a conversation, leaning in close. He nodded politely, but his posture was guarded. One of them gestured at him, possibly making some offer or suggestion. He gave a curt shake of his head. A moment later, they shrugged and wandered off, muttering under their breath. It wasn't an outright confrontation, more like they were testing his openness to deals or trades. It's common in here, especially with a new arrival who might have deep pockets. I picked up a crumpled magazine off the table, flipping through the pages without really reading. My mind kept drifting back to how Diddy had stared at that chicken patty. On the outside, that man had the power to shape entire industries. Now he was wrestling with whether or not to eat a processed slab of meat on stale bread. The absurdity of it made me sigh. Prison can be the great equalizer. After a while, a guard announced it was time to head to assigned tasks. I put down the magazine and rose from the bench. As Raul and I passed Diddy, I gave him a brief nod. He nodded back, his gaze a mix of frustration and resignation, like he was still trying to process the morning's meal. I wondered if he was thinking about the fancy lunches he used to have, maybe sushi delivered to his office, or a private chef crafting gourmet dishes. Now he had to choke down a rubbery patty, reliant on luck for a ketchup packet. We split off in different directions. Raul and I went to mop hallways. Diddy joined a line of other newcomers, likely heading to some orientation or routine check-in. As I pushed my mop down the corridor, I kept picturing him in that chow hall seat, chewing slowly, eyes flickering with disbelief. It was a look I remembered well from my early days, half hunger, half shock. By the end of the day, I knew the same question would come back to haunt him. Am I going to eat enough at dinner, or will I be hungry all night? It's a thought we all wrestle with, one that defines prison life more than many outsiders realize. Food is never just food here. It's a reminder that your choices are gone. And that, I suspected, was the hardest part for a man who once called all the shots. He'd have to learn how to cope, or this place would eat away at him just as surely as the rubbery patties and soggy vegetables. Chapter 4. Dinner. The last meal of the day. By mid-afternoon, the prison halls stir with a restless tension. Everyone knows dinner is coming, even if it's too early to be called dinner anywhere else in the world. The loudspeaker crackles, announcing the shift change for guards. Inmates mill about, some pacing in their cells, others glancing at the clock as though it might magically slow down. I've come to realize that in here, time can feel like a punishment all by itself. Around 4 o'clock, the guards start shouting for us to line up. Some guys sigh, rolling their eyes at the routine. Others move quickly, anxious not to miss their meal. Raul and I head out of our cell, merging into the procession. Ahead of us, I spot Diddy's distinctive figure. He's tall enough to stand out, but he's begun keeping his head low, shoulders slightly hunched. Maybe he's trying to avoid the looks from curious inmates. We reach the chow hall, and the air hits us first. A warm, stale smell of overcooked starch. The line creeps forward, and I catch a glimpse of tonight's menu. Salisbury steak, a glob of gravy, instant mashed potatoes, and a scoop of something green. Might be peas, might be green beans chopped up. Hard to tell from a distance. There's also a small square of cake or brownie at the end, though its appearance is always more promising than its taste. When it's my turn, the kitchen worker drops the patty on my tray, then spoons gravy over it. He adds a scoop of potatoes and a small portion of peas. At the end of the line, another worker hands me a paper cup with water and plops a piece of what looks like chocolate cake onto the tray. I mutter a quick thanks and step aside. Raul is right behind me, complaining under his breath that the gravy smells weird. I just shrug. After so many years, my nose can't tell the difference. Scanning the hall, I find an open spot. A few seconds later, Diddy appears, navigating the rows of tables. He ends up sitting 2 seats away from me, but with his back turned slightly. Still, I can see him lift the corner of his tray, eyeing the steak. He prods it with a plastic spork, testing its firmness. Then he tries the potatoes, dipping in carefully. A flicker of displeasure crosses his face, but he continues. Hunger must be winning over revulsion. I cut my own patty with the side of the spork, an art form I've perfected, and take a bite. It's salty, the gravy thick and artificial, but it's calories. The mashed potatoes feel clumpy, but I swallow them anyway. Across the table, an inmate comments that the peas taste like rubber. Another curses about the dryness of the cake. Conversations swirl around me, but I'm focused on finishing the meal. If I don't, I know I'll regret it around 9 or 10 when my stomach starts to complain. I glance at Diddy. He's methodical, trying to eat enough to keep from going hungry without fully submitting to the taste. I notice he's pushing the peas aside. Maybe he can't handle their canned flavor yet. He lifts the cup of water, washing down each bite like it's medicine. At one point, he pauses, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The chow hall is always muggy around dinner time, bodies packed together in lines, steam from the kitchen drifting out. A group of inmates at the next table begins laughing loudly. One of them points a plastic fork in Diddy's direction. I don't catch the exact joke, but from their sneers, it's something about him being too fancy to stomach the food. Diddy doesn't turn around. Maybe he's learned to ignore the jabs, or maybe he's just too tired to engage. That's often the best strategy. Pretend you don't hear it, keep your head down, and focus on surviving the next bite. I notice he's eaten half the steak. He tries a small piece of the cake, then grimaces. Prison cake can look sweet and inviting, but it often tastes like chalk mixed with sugar. He forces down another bite, probably for the sake of the extra calories. As the minutes pass, the guards start urging people to wrap it up. The chatter swells to a final crescendo before the exodus. Trays clack against each other as inmates stack them at the exit. I finish my meal, tossing my trash into a large bin and line up. Diddy stands a few spots ahead, scraping off the last of his peas and leftover gravy. He lingers a moment over the cake, as if debating whether to keep it for later. But saving a perishable item can be risky. Food spoils fast, and roaches are an ever-present threat. He discards it, then steps into the corridor. We shuffle back toward the unit, the hallway illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. A guard keeps pace beside us, his baton tapping lightly against his hip. Another day, another dinner done. For me, the uneasy part of the night is yet to come. Lockdown. Hours with nothing to do but think and feel your stomach grumble if you didn't eat enough. For Diddy, I suspect that feeling is magnified. He's not used to relinquishing control over something as basic as mealtime. Once in the unit, I see him pause near the common area, holding his tray slip. He looks around, maybe hoping to spot someone he can trade with. He's probably learned by now that a pack of instant coffee or some commissary snack could help ward off hunger later. But the day's trades seem to have ended. Most guys have scattered to their cells or are occupied with other tasks. I stop by the phone station to check if there's a free slot. No luck. 3 inmates wait in line, each with a grim expression. Calls in prison are precious currency, as restricted as everything else. I glance over at Diddy. He stepped aside, leaning against the wall. Our eyes meet. He gives a curt nod, almost like a silent greeting. I wonder if he's thinking about the dinner he just ate, or the lack thereof. Raoul taps my shoulder, reminding me we've got to get back to the cell before lockdown. We head upstairs, the concrete steps cold under our thin shoes. Halfway up, I look down and spot Diddy trudging slowly behind us, eyes on the ground. He looks neither angry nor sad, just resigned. Maybe he's already thinking ahead. Is there a way to get a snack before lights out? Should I ration something from tomorrow's meals? That's how quickly you learn in here. Each meal is strategic, each crumb a piece of the puzzle in surviving until morning. Once in the cell, Raoul flops onto his bunk, letting out a long sigh. That gravy was something else, he mumbles. I agree, though I'm more concerned about how quickly my stomach will start to rumble. Usually by 9, I'm wishing I'd stuffed myself more. But no matter how gross it tastes, there's never enough to keep you fully satisfied until breakfast. The guard's voice booms through the loudspeaker, telling everyone to lock in. Doors slam shut, the clang echoing through the block. I lie down, arms behind my head, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts drift, picturing Diddy in his cell, maybe pacing, maybe lying down too. Is he replaying dinner in his mind, cursing the blandness of the food? Or is he already formulating a plan to adapt? I recall that first day, how he looked at his tray with outright disbelief. Now, he's eating just enough to survive. He's still not embracing it, but he's not refusing it either. That's a subtle shift, one that often sneaks up on you. After a while, the shock of prison meals dulls, and all that's left is the raw fact that you need to eat. Night settles over the unit, and the fluorescent lights dim, but never fully go out. I hear the muffled coughs of inmates in nearby cells, someone muttering in their sleep. My stomach churns slightly. I probably should have eaten more potatoes. The hours stretch ahead, hours in which the only thing to do is try to sleep off the nagging hunger. In the darkness, I close my eyes and imagine what dinner must have looked like in Diddy's old life. Probably not at 4 in the afternoon, probably not a soggy patty drenched in artificial gravy. Yet here he is, forced to accept a meal schedule he can't control, flavors he can't stomach, and a system that treats everyone equally in its own harsh way. In that realization, there's a kind of grim camaraderie. We're all stuck counting down to the next tray, the next chance at a full stomach. Whether or not it ever feels satisfying is another story. Chapter 5. The Commissary, where money still talks. A few days later, word got around that Diddy had received a hefty deposit into his inmate account. That's not unusual for celebrities. Friends or family on the outside often send money to help them get by, but in here, a big deposit attracts attention. Commissary Day is once a week, and if you've got funds, you can order items that make life a tiny bit more bearable. Ramen packs, chips, instant coffee, candy bars, soap, shampoo, even small luxuries like honey buns. That morning, I stood in the common area filling out my commissary slip. Raoul leaned over, squinting at my choices. "You really want the chili-flavored ramen?" he teased. "Heard it's spicier than the regular." I shrugged. Anything to break the monotony. The guard collecting slips gave us a bored look, then moved on. I noticed Diddy at a nearby table, pencil in hand, poring over the commissary list. He looked slightly bewildered, like he couldn't decide how much to buy or which items were worth it. I remembered my own confusion when I first arrived. The prices feel inflated, and you have to balance wants and needs. One bag of chips might be cheaper than another, but less filling. Peanut butter packs are a hot commodity. Instant coffee can be traded for almost anything. Ramen is prized for its versatility. There's a system to it that outsiders would find absurd. The guard came around, scooped up the slips from each table and left. Commissary orders would be processed overnight, and the pickup line would form the next afternoon. That night, I slept fitfully, half excited about my ramen and coffee. It's a sad commentary on prison life, but small pleasures mean a lot here. When commissary day arrived, we lined up outside a window in a narrow corridor. One by one, inmates showed their IDs, and an officer handed over a small brown paper bag containing their items. Some guys got next to nothing, either because they were broke or out of credit. Others, like me, had a modest haul. 2 packs of ramen, a pouch of peanut butter, and a few sticks of instant coffee. Then Diddy stepped up. The officer pulled out a larger bag, looked heavier than most. His name was called, and he took the bag with a careful grip. Immediately, I felt a subtle shift in the air. A few inmates behind him exchanged glances. Large orders invite curiosity, and in some cases, envy. Diddy turned away, trying to appear nonchalant, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. I grabbed my own bag and walked back to the unit. Raoul rummaged through his purchase. A couple of candy bars, some ramen, a spare deodorant. We found a table and sat down to examine our loot, which is the unofficial ritual. Nearby, Diddy sat by himself, quietly taking stock of what he had. He seemed almost overwhelmed. Chips, cookies, coffee, several ramen packs, peanut butter, and a few hygiene items. It was more than most new inmates get. 2 younger guys sidled over, eyeing the stash. They made some friendly chatter about how they missed commissary this week, hinting they were short on funds. Diddy gave them a polite shake of his head, not offering a handout. The guys backed off, but I caught the flicker of resentment in their eyes. In prison culture, some folks expect the wealthy to spread the wealth. Refusal can be read as arrogance or stinginess. Throughout the next few days, I watched how Diddy handled his newfound resources. Early in the morning, he'd fix himself a cup of instant coffee rather than endure the watery brew from the chow hall. I saw him nibble on candy bars after dinner, probably to stave off hunger. He'd keep some items tucked in his cell for late-night cravings, especially if the day's meals were particularly unappetizing. But wealth in commissary form can also paint a target on your back. It wasn't long before rumors circulated that certain inmates were planning to extort him. I heard talk in the showers, loose whispers about how he should pay a tax or contribute something for protection. Others speculated that he might try to buy friends or allies. In reality, Diddy seemed to be forging his own path, neither flaunting his goods nor handing them out freely. One afternoon, while I was mopping the corridor, I saw him near the stairs with a couple of bigger inmates blocking his way. I couldn't catch the entire conversation, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. One of them tapped Diddy's commissary bag, saying something about respect. Diddy held his ground, his posture tense. Before it escalated, a guard rounded the corner, and the two inmates melted away as if nothing had happened. Diddy exhaled, adjusting the strap on his bag, and walked off. It was a clear sign that he needed to tread carefully. Over time, Diddy started making small trades. I'd see him exchange a peanut butter packet for a hot sauce sachet, or a bag of chips for a couple of ramen packs. He seemed to grasp the unspoken economy that thrives here. Some nights, he'd sit at a table sipping his instant coffee while others drank water, occasionally offering a packet of sugar to someone he got along with. He wasn't trying to be a hero, just navigating a system where a granola bar can broker peace or incite conflict depending on who you hand it to. Word spread that he wasn't giving handouts. If he shared, it was by choice or a fair trade. This stance earned him a cautious respect from some and quiet hostility from others. In prison, generosity can be a trap. Once you start giving without boundaries, everyone expects a piece of you, and if you refuse someone down the line, it can turn ugly. But being too stingy can also backfire, making you look weak or paranoid. The best route is a middle path, one that's hard for a newcomer to find. I recall one evening in the common area, Diddy had a bag of chips in front of him, the crinkling of the plastic echoing above the TV's low volume. An inmate named Banks approached, known for his smooth-talking ways. Banks tossed a small pack of coffee on the table and asked for the chips. They haggled quietly, coming to a deal. No yelling, no threats, just two men negotiating. When the transaction was over, Banks clapped Diddy on the shoulder and walked away. It was a small moment, but it signaled that Diddy was learning how to hold his own. Still, I wondered if the tension might boil over. Others saw that bag of goods and thought about what they could score. Sometimes, an inmate will wait until you're alone, corner you, and demand a cut. I caught glimpses of guys eyeing him with calculating expressions. He always moved quickly through corridors, rarely lingering, as if anticipating trouble. I understood that. When you have something people want, you can't relax. At night, I sometimes heard him rattling instant coffee granules into a cup when the rest of the block was quiet. Late-night hunger or restlessness can be brutal in here. A small comfort like hot coffee can keep your mind off the fact that you're locked in. It's what money buys you in prison. Not freedom, but a cushion against the daily grind. Of course, that cushion can vanish if you don't play your cards right. By the end of the month, I could see how commissary had become Diddy's lifeline. He was still dealing with the cafeteria trays. Those didn't improve, but at least he could supplement them with snacks or coffee, take the edge off the hunger that haunted him at night. The question was whether he'd figure out the intricate social puzzle. Who to trade with, who to avoid, when to show generosity, and when to keep the bag shut. One miscalculation could land him in a mess. In the meantime, the rest of us watched from a distance. Some inmates hoped he'd fail, jealous of the extra resources at his disposal. Others rooted for him quietly, figuring if he could navigate the system, maybe they could befriend him or benefit in some small way. Me, I remained on the sidelines, observing. Commissary in prison is like a microcosm of the real world. Money talks, but it doesn't always say what you want it to say. Diddy was learning that truth day by day, one peanut butter packet at a time. Chapter 6. Hunger Pains. The long nights. Nighttime in prison is a peculiar beast. The cells lock down, and suddenly the corridors go from bustling to eerily quiet, except for the distant buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional guard's footsteps. You can hear the murmurs of men who can't sleep. Some whisper about their families, some curse their fates, others just groan with hunger that never quite fades. I've been here long enough to accept it, but I remember how bad those first months felt, lying on a thin mattress, stomach growling, knowing you can't do a thing about it until morning. Some nights you drift off out of pure exhaustion. Others you stare at the ceiling, counting cracks or imagining meals you once took for granted. The worst part is the knowledge that you can't just fix yourself a snack. Autonomy over your own hunger is gone. That's why commissary is so important. If you have a pack of noodles or a candy bar stashed away, you can take the edge off. But that only works if you've budgeted carefully or haven't been pressured into giving your supplies away. Diddy was learning that balancing act. Over the past few days, I'd seen him ration his commissary items, tucking away a bag of chips for later in the night, or saving a peanut butter pouch for the moment after dinner when the emptiness set in. One evening, after the final head count, I caught him in the corridor, returning from the water fountain. He clutched a styrofoam cup in one hand, presumably filled with hot water, and a small packet of instant soup in the other. Our eyes met briefly as he passed my cell. He nodded, a weary acknowledgement. I heard him shuffle down the row, and when I glanced out, I saw him slip into his cell, shutting the door. Moments later, a guard's voice boomed that we were on lockdown. In the quiet, I imagined him sitting on his bunk, mixing the soup, the steam rising in the dim light. That's a nightly ritual for many of us. Ramen or instant soup becomes a lifeline, a shield against hunger that gnaws at you for hours. Especially for someone who used to dine at odd hours, perhaps requesting a gourmet dish at midnight. This shift must feel crushing. My cellmate Raoul was already asleep. He snores softly, occasionally stirring. I lay there on my bunk, trying to ignore my own cravings. Dinner had been a skimpy portion of beans and rice, not enough to sustain me until morning, but I'd run low on commissary. I'd used up my ramen earlier in the week, and the next commissary pickup was still 2 days away. My stomach rumbled like thunder in the darkness. Late at night, your thoughts become sharper, cutting through distractions. I pictured Diddy alone, maybe replaying every meal he'd ever enjoyed outside. Caviar on silver platters, filet mignon in upscale restaurants, private chefs always on call. Now he was forced to wait until 4 in the afternoon for dinner, then rely on instant soup if he had the foresight to save it. Hunger can break down even the strongest ego. Sometimes you'll hear an inmate losing it in the middle of the night, pounding on the door, demanding a snack, yelling about being hungry. The guards almost never oblige, telling them to wait for breakfast. In a strange way, that's part of the system's design, to strip you of control over your own body. If you aren't prepared, you suffer until the next sanctioned mealtime. A couple of nights later, I woke to the sound of footsteps. A guard must have been making rounds. I glanced at the clock mounted high on the wall, somewhere past midnight. My stomach twisted, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much dinner. Raoul was still snoring, so I got up quietly, took a few sips from the tap water in the sink, and tried to ignore the pangs. My gaze drifted to the corridor, wondering if anyone else was awake. That's when I noticed a soft glow from Diddy's cell window. The light from inside was faint, but I could see movement, a silhouette pacing or shifting restlessly. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. The hunger, combined with the relentless hum of prison life, can keep you up for hours. Or maybe he was lost in thought, wrestling with regrets that weigh heavier at night. Morning came slowly, as it always does, with the loud buzz jolting everyone from half-sleep. We lined up for breakfast, some of us bleary-eyed, others resigned. Diddy was a few steps ahead, cradling his tray. He managed a small nod in my direction before focusing on the plastic container of powdered eggs. I wondered if he'd used up his commissary soup last night, or if he still had something stashed for the days to come. Over the following week, I observed how he coped with the nights. He began hoarding little items from each meal, a roll, an apple, or a packet of peanut butter, slipping them into his pocket. At first, he did it clumsily, making it obvious. Some inmates noticed, but no one bothered him, perhaps respecting his need to survive. Others simply didn't care, busy with their own methods of staving off hunger. Eventually, he got more discreet, tucking away a piece of cornbread with a quick motion that seemed almost automatic. Of course, not all food can be safely stored. Some items spoil in the stale heat of a cell. Bread can grow mold if left too long, and fruit bruises easily. Still, a slightly stale roll at 2 in the morning is better than nothing. I've done it myself countless times. You learn the shelf life of each item out of sheer necessity. I also saw the toll it took on him. Each night is a test of will. If you eat all your scraps too early, you're left with the emptiness gnawing at you for hours. If you wait, you have to endure the hunger pangs, waiting for that moment when it becomes too much to bear. One night, I heard him rummaging for something in his cell, probably trying to find that last piece of bread. The faint rustle of plastic echoed down the corridor, followed by silence. Sometimes, around lights out, other inmates would shuffle by, whispering about trades. Hunger fosters desperation. I'd witnessed men offering to wash another's laundry just for a half-eaten pack of noodles. Diddy might have faced those offers too. Whether he accepted or not, I never found out. He seemed to keep his circle small, rarely entertaining deals unless he initiated them. What struck me most was how, over time, he stopped looking visibly disgusted by the prison fare. Now it was simply part of the routine. He might still hate it, but he'd learned to swallow it down without outward complaint. The nights, though, remain the hardest. No matter how well you steel yourself during the day, when darkness falls and the prison settles into a restless hush, you're alone with your stomach and your thoughts. That's when reality hits hardest. You can't just walk to the fridge or call room service. You either make do with what you've hidden away, or you endure until morning. I wondered if he ever thought about how ironically far he'd fallen, from midnight feasts with private chefs to rationing a single apple half. Hunger can be humbling, but it can also sharpen you, teaching you resourcefulness you never knew you needed. In that sense, he was adapting. He might still feel the pangs, but he was fighting back with peanut butter packets and pieces of stale bread, holding on to whatever dignity he could salvage. One night, just before lockdown, I caught him leaning against a wall in the common area, sipping from a cup of instant coffee. Our eyes met, and he gave a quiet nod, as though to say, "Yeah, I'm still here." I nodded back, hearing the guard's steps approach. Moments later, the block fell into the usual forced silence. Lights dimmed, doors locked, and all that remained were the hum of the fixtures and the steady drum of hunger we'd learned to live with. Chapter 7: Food as Power, Bartering and Respect. The longer Diddy stayed, the clearer it became that prison has its own version of economics. Cash in your commissary account translates to instant coffee, ramen, and snack cakes, which in turn become currency you can wield for favors or alliances. A single honey bun can be an apology, a peace offering, or a bribe, depending on how you use it. Ramen is gold, especially the spicy flavors. When you have items people want, you hold a kind of power, even if it's fleeting and fragile. At first, Diddy seemed reluctant to engage in trades. Maybe he thought money alone would buy him peace. But behind these walls, physical cash means nothing if you don't learn the rules. Eventually, I saw him start small. He'd trade a peanut butter packet for a hot sauce sachet, or a bag of chips for a couple of fruit cups. These deals seemed harmless, but they served a bigger purpose. showing he understood the unspoken economy. Banks, an older inmate known for orchestrating bigger trades, was the one who really tested Diddy. I witnessed their first encounter in the common area. Banks placed 2 packs of instant coffee on the table, telling Diddy that coffee was a premium. In return, he wanted 3 peanut butter packets. Diddy hesitated, clearly unsure if that was a fair deal. Banks insisted coffee was worth more. After a tense moment, Diddy proposed a middle ground, 2 peanut butter packets plus half a sleeve of cookies. Banks smiled, agreed, and the trade went down. Nearby onlookers nodded in approval. If you can negotiate, you earn a bit of respect here. Word spread that Diddy wasn't a pushover. He wouldn't just hand over items because someone demanded a tax. Yet he also wasn't so tight-fisted that he alienated everyone. He walked that thin line between generosity and self-preservation. A few younger inmates started gravitating toward him, offering small services, cleaning his cell bars or saving him a spot in line in exchange for snacks. This gave him a kind of informal entourage, not a gang affiliation, but a group that offered some buffer. Of course, prison politics never run smoothly. One evening I heard shouts in the yard. 2 men squared off, one accusing the other of cheating him out of a coffee trade. Fists flew before the guards intervened. Later, rumors surfaced that the fight started over a single ramen pack. That's how quickly things can escalate. I wondered if Diddy grasped that a seemingly innocent trade could ignite real danger if someone felt shortchanged. He learned that lesson firsthand when a couple of well-built inmates cornered him one afternoon near the shower area. I caught sight of it while passing by on my cleaning shift. They had him up against the wall, gesturing at the commissary bag in his hand. I couldn't hear every word, but they mentioned protection, and from their tone, it wasn't a polite offer. Diddy's voice was low, calm, telling them to back off. One of them sneered, reaching for the bag, but Diddy yanked it away. Before it could escalate, another inmate, a tall, wiry guy named Mace, stepped in. Mace's presence was enough to make them reconsider. They left with a string of curses. Diddy exhaled, gripping the bag tight. Mace simply nodded and walked off, no explanation given. Maybe he liked Diddy, or maybe he disliked bullies. Later, in the cell block, I saw Diddy talking to Mace, presumably thanking him. Mace shrugged, saying something about not tolerating that kind of strong-arming. Diddy offered him a snack, but Mace refused. "Just watch your back," he said. "Even small rescues in here can spark rumors of alliances." Some inmates would interpret it as Mace now owning Diddy, but from what I saw, it was more about principle. Despite brushes like that, Diddy managed to keep trading on his own terms. He'd swap items with guys he trusted or at least didn't fear. He wasn't throwing freebies around, but he wasn't mean-spirited either. That approach built a quiet network of mutual respect. If someone wanted coffee, they knew Diddy might trade if the offer was fair. If they tried to muscle him, they'd get nowhere. Slowly but surely, he was earning a reputation. Not soft, not a gangster, just someone who knew how to play the game. I recall one exchange in particular. A younger inmate named Torres needed a coffee fix but had no commissary left. He approached Diddy, offering to clean his cell for a week in exchange for 2 packets. Diddy eyed him for a long moment, then agreed, but only if Torres threw in an old deck of cards he had. Torres hesitated, then relented. It was a minor trade, but it showed how a single item could become a means of negotiation. Both walked away satisfied. Torres got his coffee, Diddy got free cleaning and a deck of cards he could trade again later. Of course, none of this changed the fact that the cafeteria food remained dreadful. Every mealtime we still faced the same bland trays, but having those extra snacks or drinks gave Diddy a measure of autonomy. He no longer sat there picking at his food in hopeless disgust. Now he'd eat enough to stay functional, then lean on his commissary stash when real hunger struck. The difference in his demeanor was noticeable. He seemed less haunted, more engaged, as if the fear of starving through the night had eased. That doesn't mean he became complacent. Prison's economy is volatile. and a single rumor of release or a single violent outburst can shift power dynamics. Whenever something big happened, like a major fight or an unexpected transfer, people reevaluated who had what and who might be vulnerable. Diddy stayed vigilant, rarely leaving his cell without his commissary bag. If he had to, he'd leave his goods locked away, trusting only a few guys to keep watch. In the yard, I'd sometimes see him talking quietly with Banks or Mace, discussing the next commissary day or who owed whom what. This was the new reality. Outside, he might have been cutting deals worth millions in boardrooms or VIP clubs. Inside, he was bartering packets of soup and peanut butter, navigating the same currents as the rest of us. At this point, I realized he'd come a long way from the man who stared aghast at a bologna sandwich on his first day. He was learning that food here isn't just about filling your belly. It's a tool for survival, a symbol of status, and a currency that commands respect if wielded properly. I wondered if he ever stopped to marvel at the absurdity of it all, that a man once known for extravagance was now measuring his fortunes in instant coffee and ramen noodles. Yet, that's the system. No matter how famous you are, you adapt or you break. One afternoon, as I walked past the common area, I overheard two inmates discussing him. "Gotta give him credit," one said. "He's not letting them shake him down." The other nodded. "Yeah, and he's not acting like he's better than everyone either. He trades fair." It struck me that the same qualities that might have made him successful outside, assertiveness, negotiation, reading people, were now serving him inside, albeit on a much smaller scale. No place can fully strip away who you are, but prison sure tries. Diddy was holding on to his identity in the only way he could, by mastering the small domain of commissary and bartering. In this environment, a victory is measured by how well you manage to keep your dignity intact while meeting basic needs. Ramen may not be champagne, but here it can define the line between desperation and having some kind of control. Chapter 8. Acceptance. Months slipped by in a blur of identical days. Dawn wake-ups, bland breakfasts, early lunches, and dinners served before the sun had fully set. Somewhere along the line, I noticed a subtle transformation in Diddy. Gone was the wide-eyed disbelief at each meal. Gone was the tense frustration whenever he realized there were no fancy alternatives. Instead, he now approached every chow line with stoic composure, collecting his tray as if it were any other mundane task. One evening, I found myself behind him in line for dinner. The meal du jour was meatloaf with gravy, clumpy mashed potatoes, and a small portion of canned peas. He waited, tray in hand, without a word. The kitchen worker dropped the meatloaf patty onto the plastic, then ladled some gravy on top. Diddy nodded and moved on to collect the rest. He didn't even glance at the peas. For a moment, I recalled the first time I saw him confront that lifeless cafeteria spread. How he stared in disbelief, poking at the food as if it might bite back. Now, he simply accepted it. By the time we sat down, I could see he had already cut into the patty, mixing the gravy with the potatoes. No grimace crossed his face, no hesitation. He ate quickly, pacing himself with sips of water. A few seats away, Raoul joked about how the peas tasted metallic. Diddy half smiled but kept eating. It was the smile of someone who'd made peace with the fact that complaining wouldn't change a thing. After dinner, we filed out into the corridor, where a guard stood watch. I caught up with Diddy as we neared the common area. He gave me a brief nod of acknowledgement, and I asked, "How you holding up?" We hadn't exchanged many words beyond casual greetings and nods over the past few months, but I felt compelled to check in. He shrugged, saying, "It is what it is." The resignation in his tone was palpable, neither bitter nor hopeful, just a fact of life. That evening, back in the unit, I noticed him carefully stashing an extra piece of bread he'd saved from dinner. He slipped it into a small plastic wrap, another sign that he'd learned the ropes. If night hunger came, he'd have something to bite on. Some inmates never adapt to that routine. They let themselves starve, or they beg other inmates for scraps. Diddy had found a balance. supplementing the cafeteria fare with the commissary snacks he purchased or traded for. He wasn't flaunting them, nor was he hoarding out of desperation. He simply maintained a stock to stay comfortable. Later that week, I saw him in the yard, chatting quietly with Mace while they walked slow circles around the perimeter. The tension that once coiled in his posture seemed less pronounced. Prison is still prison, but he no longer carried the frantic energy of someone in denial. He'd settled into a daily rhythm: meals, yard time, commissary trades, rationing scraps for late-night hunger. Every inmate eventually finds some version of this routine, each shaped by their own strategy for enduring. I also noticed the gossip about him had dwindled. Early on, everyone speculated how a celebrity would manage prison life. Would he pay people off? Would he join a gang? Now he was just another face in the crowd. Nobody seemed to care about the name Diddy anymore. They cared about whether he had coffee to trade or if he'd hold onto his peanut butter packets. That's how thoroughly the system can strip away the outside identity. It wasn't that he'd lost himself entirely. It was more that he'd morphed into an inmate like the rest of us. One afternoon, while waiting for lunch, an officer called my name for mail distribution. As I stepped forward, I saw Diddy nearby, watching as other inmates received letters or packages. He held no envelope in his hands. Maybe his associates sent money, but mail was less frequent now. I wondered if he felt that sting of isolation, the sense that the outside world moves on while you remain stuck behind bars. He turned away, heading into the cafeteria line without a word. The lunch was a chicken patty, rubbery as ever. He grabbed a ketchup packet this time, a small victory. I watched as he squeezed it onto the patty, no longer hesitating or grimacing. Across the table, another inmate criticized the meal, cursing under his breath. Did he listen, but didn't join the complaint? It was as if he no longer found value in complaining. He just ate, tossed the remainder, and left. That evening, I lingered in the common area, flipping through a dated newspaper someone had discarded. Diddy walked by, heading toward the phone bank. He paused, glanced at me, and asked how I was doing. It was a small question, but it struck me that he was now the one initiating conversation. I shrugged, saying I was fine, same old routine. He gave a short, understanding nod, then walked on. In that moment, I saw a hint of acceptance in his eyes, like he'd reached a place of calm about his situation. By the time lockdown neared, the guards ordered everyone back to their cells. I heard some guys whining about the dinner portion, others chatting about the next commissary day. Diddy slipped into his cell quietly. Through the small window, I saw him set down a styrofoam cup of hot water and unwrap a soup packet. That had become his nightly ritual, one final snack to keep hunger at bay. In that mundane act, I recognized a deeper truth. He wasn't just surviving the meals now. He was surviving the entire system. When the gates clanged shut and the lights dimmed, I lay on my bunk, reflecting on how far he'd come. I remembered his first day, that shell-shocked stare at a bologna sandwich. I remembered him gingerly poking at powdered eggs, discarding rubbery chicken patties, and wincing at watery coffee. I remembered the tension in his posture whenever dinner arrived at 4. As if the schedule itself was an insult to his lifestyle. Now, all of that seemed to have faded into the background. He accepted the trays handed to him, accepted the stale bread and the watery vegetables. If they were too disgusting, he'd use commissary items to fill the gap. Food no longer shocked or appalled him, it just marked the passing of another day. Breakfast meant morning count had finished, lunch meant yard time was close. Dinner meant nighttime hunger would strike soon if he didn't plan. That was the new rhythm of his life. Sure, he might still think about the feasts he once enjoyed, but now those memories probably felt like another lifetime, distant, almost dreamlike. I imagined him lying on his bunk, thinking not about caviar or champagne, but about how many ramen packs he had left for the week, or whether he had enough peanut butter to trade for a hot sauce packet. That's what acceptance looks like in prison. You don't forget who you were, but you concede that none of it matters in here. You learn the rules of this place, and you follow them if you want to keep your head above water. The next morning, I got up, shuffled to the chow hall, grabbed my tray of powdered eggs. As I sat, I saw Diddy at a distance, picking up his own tray with minimal fuss. He made his way to a corner seat. Another inmate asked if he wanted to swap his carton of milk for an extra slice of bread. Diddy nodded, the tray went down quickly, and he started eating in silence. No hesitation, no grimaces. Just another day, another meal, another reminder that this was his life now. I finished my meal, walked away, and let the rest of the block move around me. Behind me, Diddy set down his empty tray, heading out with the others. No one gawked, no one whispered. He was just an inmate among inmates, distinguished only by his ability to navigate the system with a quiet efficiency. In that sense, he'd completed the arc from shock to acceptance, and while I couldn't say he was happy, no one is truly happy in prison. He'd found a way to eat, trade, and survive without letting the routine break him completely.